All right, hello everybody. I wanted to make sure to get the rest of those review videos for your final exam ready. And here's the first one. Just forgive me, just as a preface, I'm actually sitting in a parking lot waiting for my yoga studio to open up. So if you hear any cars honking or anything, that's why. All right, anyway, this video is going to be on the origins of the Cold War, and we'll go up to de-Stalinization, and there's actually already a video available about that, and they'll all be on the playlist in order. So here we go. I don't think we need to go over the Unity cues, and you have access to all of these slides. So it's important, of course, to be familiar with Spodek's thesis, but I'll leave that to you to go through. Same stuff with these questions. I put them on the slides just so that you can potentially use those to quiz yourselves. Even though we don't have a written section of the final, if you can answer these questions in an analytical and logical way using the key terms as evidence, you'll be very well prepared for the more difficult multiple choice questions. So without further ado, let's start talking about some of the key terms here, right? So this slide, I wanted to put it together to make sure that you understand that there's a number of different strategies that the Cold War is using to stop the spread of communism. So actually, another title that I could have given this slide is literally the containment policy, right? And hopefully remember that the idea, right, is exactly what it sounds like, right? The containment policy was a multifaceted effort to attempt to stop the spread of communism. I use the word multifaceted on purpose because there's not one policy under the umbrella of the containment policy. There are a number of different strategies, and these are the most important ones, I would argue. So let's start out with the Truman Doctrine. All right, so most of this is self-explanatory on the notes, but just to make sure that you understand this in different wording, right? The Truman Doctrine, articulated by the US president at the time, Harry Truman, was more of a political tactic to attempt to, again, contain communism, right? It actually, even though it was political, one might say that it does also have military implications, and the reason why that is, it was because they were actually using a political strategy to interfere with a civil war in two different foreign countries, and those countries were Greece and Turkey. So let me back up and just provide some context there. Right? Greece and Turkey are at civil war in the early periods of the Cold War, and essentially it is a war between the establishment government and communist rebels, right? And in an attempt to make sure that the establishment government, the non-communist government, maintained power, the US government provided millions of dollars worth of aid to both Greece and Turkey so that they could defeat the communist insurgency. And in both instances, they were successful. And eventually, the byproduct of that is that Greece and Turkey, in the long run, will become members of NATO. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think the rest of it hopefully makes sense, right? So it is, to a certain extent, also an economic and political, and rather military strategy. But I put it under the category of political because a doctrine itself is not a binding act of legislation or anything else like that. It is simply a statement issued by a leading politician. And you know that because you know about the Brezhnev Doctrine, for example. Let's move on to the Marshall Plan. Pretty straightforward, right? The Marshall Plan was literally an economic package that was set up, right? I believe, yes, it may not have been quite 12 billion. I might be off on those numbers, and forgive me if I am, right? I'll double check after this is over. But the exact figure is less important than the policy itself. After World War II, you all, of course, remember that Europe, and Japan for that matter, were reduced practically to rubble in certain areas due to aerial bombing by the Nazis. And also, I might add, in Japan, by the United States. But I digress. The US decided to put together this military aid to help rebuild these war-torn countries, but they had an ulterior motive, and what that was to make sure that these countries that received that aid followed more of a capitalist path. At least, maybe they didn't say that outright, but that was their goal, so it was part of the containment policy for that reason. And with that said, it's important to acknowledge that the US actually did offer aid to the Soviet Union, but Stalin refused, which is the context and the meaning of this cartoon. But going back here, right, the Marshall Plan was largely successful, right? And most Western European countries especially ones that were heavily damaged by the Second World War, gladly received this aid. And then lastly, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right, which still exists to this day, right, was essentially a military alliance, right? And the idea behind a military alliance, as you guys know, is that any country that would be under attack, or rather, let me rephrase it, if an aggressor, right, if a country declared war on a member of NATO, then as far as all the other members of NATO are concerned, they too are at war with that aggressor nation, right? So NATO was incredibly significant because this essentially established this very powerful alliance of anti-communists in Western Europe, the United States, and Canada, right? NATO, of course, continued to grow, and we will eventually talk about the Soviet counterpart to NATO, which was the Warsaw Pact, but we'll get to that soon. How about we get to that now, actually? So the Warsaw Pact was founded in 1955 as the Soviet version, for simplicity's sake, let's just call it the Soviet version of NATO, right? You can see the major Warsaw Pact member states on this map, the neutral states, and NATO members. And by the way, like I said before, the United States and Canada are also NATO members. Okay, just to put this into context, these are not key terms, and I think hard power and soft power are pretty easy to understand. But soft power is not, of course, direct military action, right? But soft power is mainly an economic strategy, but to a certain extent also a cultural strategy, right? Or even more broadly, a strategy about idealistic values to attempt to really make people interested, make people attracted to a certain set of ideals. So, in the context of the Cold War, the United States used certain examples of soft power to make people excited about not being communists. I probably could have phrased that better. But a good example of that would be the Marshall Plan, right? If you are a beneficiary of Marshall Plan funds, then you probably are more excited about aligning yourself with the United States and maintaining a capitalist economy than you would be with aligning yourself with the Soviet Union and becoming communist, right? By the way, if none of this makes sense, just ask me questions. I think that we could ask these questions for ourselves, but I want to make sure that these videos are not overwhelmingly long. So let's move forward. You can watch that video on your own, but it's really useful. And by the way, I'm on a review slide, so all these slide numbers will match up with the slides that you can access directly. Same stuff, I would encourage you to talk about these questions as you study, maybe study in groups. Okay, I'll talk about the proxy wars. I'm looking at my watch though, and yoga's studio is about to open. You know how Miss Sutton feels about yoga. So I will stop this video and do the rest later on tonight, and I'll publish them probably at the same time. In any event, the Korean War. Okay, brief context, right? Korea, the entire Korean peninsula was colonized by Japan before and during the Second World War. After Japan lost the Second World War, the Korean peninsula was split in half. The northern half was under the influence of the USSR, and the southern half was under the influence of the United Nations, but for simplicity's sake, you could consider it to be under the U.S. sphere of influence. The communist influenced North Korea wanted to reunify the Korean peninsula as a communist state, and this was all backed by the Kim family, right? Still the family that rules North Korea today, but it was under Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. So in any event, the North Koreans invaded the South Koreans. At one point, they occupied the South Korean capital of Seoul, but eventually, when the United Nations, largely controlled by the U.S. military, intervened, the U.S. regained ground. And if you can see from these, actually, rather, I should stay on this map first. The U.S. ends up not only regaining Seoul, but pushing much farther north. And they reach, I forget how close they are to the Chinese border, but you can see that they're super close to the Yalu River, which is the border between China and North Korea. When the U.S. gets that close to China, the Chinese really rapidly mobilized their own military to aid North Korea. So about 100,000 Chinese soldiers mobilized on the northern Korean border. And eventually, after about 3 years, more like 2 years of stalemate, the North and South Koreans sign an armistice or a ceasefire, and the new border, what is now called the demilitarized zone, is this green line here. And since it's a ceasefire, that means technically North and South Korea could resume this war at any time. Next proxy war we want to know about is Vietnam. And I think I clarified this way back when we talked about this at the beginning of the year, but I just put this asterisk here because even though this is sort of the traditional date range for the war in Vietnam, one could say that it started much earlier than that, after the French were defeated by the Vietnamese at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, because the U.S. started sending military advisors into Vietnam as early as the 1950s, as early as 54. But it officially starts, quote unquote, because it never really was a war by congressional standards, I digress, in 1964. Okay? The reason why this is so important, in a way, the context is similar, sort of. North and South Vietnam were too divided. The northern half was under the influence of communism under their leader Ho Chi Minh. The southern half was more under the influence of capitalists and the United States. This war was far longer and far more deadly. The upshot, you don't have to worry about all the individual battles. You'll cover those more in 11th grade U.S. history. But the long-term impact was that eventually Ho Chi Minh and the northern Vietnamese military, the Viet Cong, ends up defeating the Southerners, who end up fleeing Saigon in 1975. So actually, I should have said 75. That's when Saigon falls. 73 is when the Americans withdraw their troops. The end result is that Vietnam is reunited as a communist state. It is still, it's more of a socialist state now, but in any event, Vietnam is still one nation, right? And so if we think about the importance of, I have the domino effect somewhere on here. There we go. If you think about the importance of the domino effect, and even more broadly, the containment policy, one could say that in Korea, the containment policy was largely successful, even though the US and the UN failed to unify Korea as one entire country as capitalists. They stop the spread of communism farther south. However, in the case of Vietnam, they fail because Vietnam is entirely under the influence of communists by the end of the war. Okay, the Red Scare, I think, is pretty easy to understand. This slide literally only has these cartoons, or not cartoons, the propaganda, right? But really, the takeaway is this. This is Senator Joseph McCarthy in the United States. He sort of spearheaded, obviously, the McCarthy era, but he was also one of the most important fear-mongers during the Red Scare, right? And essentially what he did was he ended up arguing that he had a list of communists or communist sympathizers that had very influential positions in U.S. society. Some of them were actors. Some of them were actually members of the military and members of governments. And this was blown so far out of proportion that eventually McCarthy himself was interrogated for essentially making up this information, which indeed he did. His list was actually entirely made up. McCarthy ended up sort of, well, he died due to alcohol-related causes, but his life ended in disgrace. So it's not to say that the Red Scare wasn't partially rooted in a true fear of the influence of the Soviet Union, but the idea that there were communist infiltrators all over the United States was largely exaggerated, but it made the United States terrified of the potential for the Soviet Union to take over the world. We already talked a little bit about the domino effect. I think this makes a lot of sense, but yet again, it was a reason to justify intervention in foreign countries, a reason to justify the US getting involved in proxy wars. Here's Gaddis's thesis. You could compare that to Spodek's thesis, and what do you know? Here we are at de-Stalinization, and there's already a video for that. So it's time to do some yoga, but afterwards I'll put together some of the videos on South Africa that we're still missing. Thanks for watching. So long.